It's week 4 of 2018, and this week we're still talking about Spectre and Meltdown patches. We've also got some news from Linux, as well as some cloud scenarios to look at, and Don introduces a new category, game shows. So we'll see what that's all about coming up on the ITProTV podcast, starting right now. Hello and welcome to the ITProTV podcast. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, and I am joined, as always, by Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing today?
I am, excited about today's podcast. We do have the general assortment of news that we usually cover, and we have one just totally bizarre article. I was trying to do some build-up with Peter before the show on that we'll get to towards the end.
It's one of those almost where, hey, have you read this? No? Well, don't read it yet. I can't wait to tell you about it. But it is week 4 of 2018. I don't have to write checks anymore, so I don't know where I'll be screwing that up, probably here, but it's 2018, week 4. And believe it or not, we're starting off with something we've been talking about since probably week 52 or 51 of 2017, but Spectre. The Spectre vulnerability was uncovered, and patches were quickly released to try to address those. And now patches are being released to address the patches. And basically, we're at a point where Intel is saying, stop installing our patches. So, Don, what is going on? What do we do?
This is quickly turning into what military personnel would call a Charlie Foxtrot. It's a total just mess. This happens when you have a significant security flaw and companies rush to push out a fix, right? And especially when you have more than one company involved, right? So the problem for Meltdown actually stemmed from Intel processors, right? That's where the problem was. And so Intel basically came up with a fix, but they can't deploy that. Instead, they have to give it to the motherboard manufacturers and the other OEMs that are out there and get them to push it in. So there is a whole challenge there with delivering the fix. And we saw that last week and the week before, the challenges with Meltdown. But that was just Intel. Now we get Spectre in the mix, right? And Spectre affects every platform, right? ARM, AMD, Intel, so not just limited. And with Spectre, it's up to the operating system vendors to fix it. And so now you have like Microsoft with Windows or Apple with Mac OS trying to patch it across all these different processors. And it's been rushed so much, they haven't tested it, that it's running into problems. And we're starting to see more and more companies say, look, we can't push this fix out the way it is, right? And that's what Intel is basically saying is, look, we came up with this fix, but it's buggy. It's got some problems. And the number one problem that people are seeing, if you haven't seen this yourself, is that you apply the fix, and then sometimes your computer will boot up just fine. Sometimes it will fail to boot. It'll lock up during boot up. And usually if you just turn it off, turn it back on again, it works, right? And some people, I know one of our viewers, James, I was talking to earlier this week, he said that it's really every other boot. For him, it is, wow. Hey, I just learned I push power and it doesn't come on. I push power to turn it off and I turn it back on again and everything's fine. Woo, right?
That's the new normal.
That's the new normal.
What is he on? Is it a PC?
He's on a PC.
Okay.
Yep, that was a Windows. Actually, wait a minute. Is he running Ubuntu on that? It might have been a Linux box, but it doesn't really matter at that point because it's the processor that's causing the problem. But that is a big challenge people are seeing. And on a laptop or a desktop, it's inconvenient. On a server, yeah, that's a big deal. That's a challenge that is difficult to overcome. And so Intel is basically saying, well, let's uninstall that update and we'll figure something else out.
Well, here's my question about that, because this article that we're talking about, this is a PC World article, and it's Intel saying, stop installing our buggy Spectre CPU firmware fixes. Now, obviously, that's a headline, so they're kind of paraphrasing there. But so this is Intel's patch, or are you saying in a situation where you've got, Microsoft, you've got Apple, you've got, all these different manufacturers that are dealing with this, is it Intel's job to patch that? Is it Microsoft's job to patch that?
Well, that's where this gets tough, right? Yeah. So Intel basically wrote this firmware fix, right? But they can't deploy it. And instead, they provided that fix, and they provided it to Microsoft, to Apple, to these various vendors, and they're now applying the fix. So when it breaks, whose fault is it? Well, you could say maybe the operating system vendor didn't apply it right, but
if
more
they're all
likely,
breaking, it sounds like this is an issue
yeah.
with the original patch. Okay.
And companies like Microsoft, they have a lot of insight into Intel, but Intel has a lot of proprietary information they don't share that is on the inner workings of their processor. So, if Intel can't fix this, then Linus Torvalds, I don't know if you saw his comments last week, where he was saying, look, these are buggy, crappy updates, and Intel is doing a terrible job. When somebody like Linus Torvalds, who is just the key player in the Linux kernel world, when he's looking at these bug fixes and saying, this isn't going to work, you guys aren't trying very hard, that usually means that it's not going to work and Intel's not trying very hard. So I'm curious to see where it goes, but this is definitely spreading out. There's another article, I want to bring this one up here from Tom's Hardware, same idea, except instead of Intel saying don't install it, it's system OEMs recall Meltdown and Spectre patches. So now you've got companies like Acer, ASRock, Dell, HP, all motherboard manufacturers, right? People who are supposed to be applying the Intel bug fixes saying, screw it. It's making our systems unstable. It's affecting performance. It's doing all sorts of crazy things. Don't deploy it, right? And not only don't deploy it, they're saying, hey, let's uninstall it. If you've actually applied the patch or fix and you can still remove it, you should, because things become unstable. So you're having to pick between stability or security. And that's something we as a consumer shouldn't have to do. You shouldn't have to pick between those two. That if they can't make it secure and stable, it shouldn't be sold yet, right? It's not ready. Imagine a car, like somebody manufactures a car that can't survive an accident and also can't run without going to the mechanic for a month. That wouldn't sell. But here we have the world's most popular processor manufacturer basically giving us just that.
Yeah, every other time I put the key in the car, it doesn't start. Like that would be the same kind of thing.
But I just get out and get back in?
That wouldn't work. Now, so let's play a fun game for a second, which I like to call the blame game. So it sounds like on the Meltdown side that's an Intel specific thing. It's easy to kind of place blame there, and it's easy to place blame. It sounds like on Intel as well for these patches, because if all these people are pulling them back, it sounds like a problem with the patch itself. But one that I'd like to kind of remind that we talked about a few podcasts ago when this first came out is the way that this vulnerability came to light. It was the correct way. It was discovered by some research teams that were able to find these things and actually work together with another team that had found kind of the other side of Spectre Meltdown, and then they went and reported it, and giving the manufacturers an opportunity to create those bugs and get them out. But somewhere along that line, it was leaked out, and a media outlet reported it and basically said, hey, look what's happening, forcing these fixes to come out before we had the opportunity to have all this happen on the back end without any of us seeing it, which would have been great to let Intel put out this patch, say, hey guys, does this work? No, let's fix it. All right, now let's release it to everyone. So, I know when you got a story, you want to run with it. I come from a telecom news kind of background, but there's also kind of a responsible reporting thing here in my mind.
And in the beginning, when this whole story broke, I commented on how it was really irresponsible of the Register to do that, right? That was the media outlet that originally rushed with this article. But it was a week early, right? So it was 1 week before the actual disclosure date that they released it. And so now the updates had to be rushed. Well, the updates had to be rushed by 1 week. So I don't know if, like, this has been botched so bad at this point that if you had given Intel an extra week, would that have made a difference, right? I think back to like some of the papers that I wrote in college, that if I had an extra hour, it wouldn't have been any better. And so I kind of feel like that's where we're at here, is that they came up with a potential easy fix, right? What they're trying to do is create a fix that doesn't require a recall. Because if they have to do a recall, these processors are everywhere. It would be a significant hit on the company.
I just try to think how many are in this room, between the computers over there, over here, our phones, the cameras. I don't know. Are those Intel chips?
Absolutely
all
true.
The fake servers in the rack behind Don.
Yep. Now Spectre affects everything. Spectre should be able to be fixed in software. Meltdown, though, I mean, that's a hardware problem.
Yeah.
And that one's just affecting Intel. And if Intel had to do a recall, that would be a big deal. So they're trying these software fixes, and they're not stable. So I'm curious to see if eventually, like the government or somebody could step in and mandate, you've got to do a recall on this. But the other thing we have to remember is how damaging this exploit is, or really how not damaging it is. That there aren't known exploits for this that are roaming in the wild. That if somebody were able to compromise my system to the level they could take advantage of Meltdown and Spectre, they've already compromised the system, so it doesn't matter. So the only real high risk we have are for cloud vendors. That for the Amazons and Google Compute Engine and Microsoft Azure, those data centers where they've got multi-tenant installations, that's where the big liability, the big risk is. So the average consumer isn't necessarily affected all that much by all this.
And to that end, you were telling me about some vendors that are basically saying, we're not going to do patches. Was it Red Hat?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That was one of the first ones where I heard, and this was prior to Intel making their announcement, like, hey, roll that back. When Intel said roll or stop deploying our update, they didn't say we're not going to deploy another update. They just said stop deploying this one. We're going to fix it. We'll send you a new one. And Microsoft and Apple, they all kind of said, all right, we're going to stop rolling this out and we'll wait till there's a new one. But Red Hat, they came out and do I have that? That's not it. Well, actually, I guess I don't have it. But Red Hat made an announcement saying, look, variant 2 of the patch is just not stable. It's causing systems not to boot. It's causing problems. We're going to roll it back, and we're not applying an update for that. We're not going to apply a patch for it. And that, you might say, well, great, now I can't trust Red Hat. I'm not going to run that one. But that's not really what's at the core. What's at the core is that it shouldn't be up to Red Hat to make sure that the Intel processor works the way that it should. It should be up to Intel. And that's basically the stance that Red Hat is taking. Like, we're focused on the stability of our software. Intel needs to be focused on the stability of their processor. So we'll see where that all pans out over the next few weeks. It's just ongoing drama.
And so, with Red Hat just continuing on with life as usual, they have released Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7.5 public beta now. So is that something that you run Ubuntu on one and Red Hat on another? Is that
I run Red Hat and Fedora.
Fedora? Yep. Okay, so
yep.
Is this something you're gonna try out or?
Yeah, so Red Hat, they have a real slow release cycle. That operating systems like Fedora and Ubuntu, they're on these 6-month rolling release cycles. But with Red Hat, they're focused on stability, right? So it's not uncommon for them to only release a minor version update once a year. Now, there's tons of security updates and bug fixes and patches and things of that nature, but as far as a major revision, those don't happen all that often. In fact, Red Hat 7 came out years and years ago. And so people have been asking, hey, when is Red Hat 8 coming out? Well, not in 2018.
Yeah.
Maybe in 2019. But it looks like in 2018, we are going to be getting Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7.5, which means if you're a CentOS user, we'll be getting CentOS 7.5. Usually CentOS trails Red Hat Enterprise Linux by a few months, but if this releases in 2018, then we'll get CentOS in 2018 as well. But that 7.5 beta is now out in the public beta. So if anybody wants to give it a shot and kind of see what's coming up, that one is released. They did a blog post on the Red Hat blog over at redhat.com/blog. And they highlight some of the features that are in it, some of the things to look forward to. There's more Red Hat Ansible automation. Red Hat is obviously likes Ansible a lot since they did the acquisition. And so you'll see things like that in here, as well as some time protocol changes that are being rolled out on the security side. On the performance side, there's Virtual Data Optimizer, or VDO, that's being baked in, and some other management platform stuff that's being built in to improve that and make it available. But it's that next progression. I'm still keeping an eye on it because I want to see. I'm kind of curious which version of GNOME it's going to end up with, because the version of GNOME that was in Red Hat 7.4 was getting a little bit dated, so 7.5 has a chance to fix that. And normally, closer to release, we'll see where they finally settle in on, here's the version of PHP that we're going to use, here's the version of glibc, and all those other things that you can't normally update without breaking support in Red Hat. So we'll start to find some of that, which is really nice. to see a new version of that coming down the line.
Yeah, so I've kind of been familiar with the beta cycles in Windows, but how long does Red Hat normally take between when they push a beta like this and when they actually come out live?
It varies. Normally, I would say about 6 months.
Okay.
But it hasn't been like that recently. Fedora specifically, for those of you that don't know, Fedora is kind of like Red Hat's test world, right? So they test new features in Fedora, and after they've been proven stable, then they bring them into Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And Fedora has actually been missing some of their release dates lately because they're kind of testing stuff out, and it's taking a little bit longer. But to give you guys an idea, if you just do like a quick Google search for RHEL timeline, you can start to see the release dates on some of this. And I've got it kind of pulled up here on my screen, where Red Hat 4 came out in 2005 and Red Hat 5 came out in 2007, 2 years apart, right? And then it got to be 3 years apart before Red Hat 6 came out. And then 4 years for Red Hat 7 in 2014. Now we're in 2018 already. And so they're saying that we're not going to see the next one until 2019, so it's going to be 5 years. Like the window is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So the stuff that we're used to seeing is changing now. And so normally I would say, yeah, it's 6 months. Public beta's out there. Within 6 months, we'll have 7.5, but I just don't know that's going to hold true anymore.
All right. Well, in other Linux news, we've got some changes, some new features coming to the Linux 4.16 kernel. And I know, Don, that you're extremely excited about that. So I'll let you tell me what's coming there. I do see in the article the words Meltdown and Spectre, so I'm already excited.
Yeah. So with the Linux kernel, a lot of people have a preference with Linux distros. I want Ubuntu, or I want RHEL, or I want CentOS, or Fedora, or whatever. At the end of the day, they're all running the Linux kernel. And when the Linux kernel sees an update, some of the distros will pick that up really fast, like Debian testing or Ubuntu. They'll get those new kernels really fast. Other ones like RHEL will take longer to get them because they want to prove stability and security, right? So whenever a new version of the kernel comes out, though, they bake in new features, and those trickle out to the operating system. So if you want to see what's coming down the road, even if you have a distro that's not very popular, if you watch the kernel updates, you'll start to see that. So the 4.15 kernel, it either is about to release or is already released as of today. That one it got delayed a little bit over the weekend. So that should be out by now, or by the time you guys hear this podcast at least, unless it gets delayed again. But they're already planning for the features they're going to shoot for in 4.16. And these are features that we should see within the next year. Now, there were a couple of features like Peter mentioned where there's Spectre and Meltdown patches, the KPTI stuff that gets built in to the kernel, so it's protected, and now we don't have to worry about whether our distro releases the update, because minor distros, they didn't get a nice little note from Intel saying, here's how you fix it, and here's the data you need. Only the big distros got that. So now it'll be baked into the kernel, which is nice. There's some other things that are starting to be introduced. The VirtualBox guest driver is going to be baked into 4.16. So those of you that run Linux inside of VirtualBox, you won't have to install the guest driver anymore. So that'll help out a good bit there. But some of the cooler features, things like AMD's secure encrypted virtualization support, they're going to try and bake that one in, which would be nice for the people that are virtualizing an AMD environment, which admittedly is not a lot. But the biggest one that I noticed as I was kind of skimming down the list was BTRFS RAID improvements. BTRFS, or the Butter file system, depending on who you ask. A lot of people out there love it. Some people hate it. There's people like me who will tell you right now, don't use BTRFS in production. And there's other people who say, I swear by BTRFS and I use it everywhere, right? The reason I say don't use it in production is that if you use it in a basic form, like you just format a drive with one slice and you drop BTRFS on it and that's it, it runs very stable, it does a fine job. But when you get complex, when you start doing multi-volume deployments, things like a RAID array, there are several data loss scenarios in BTRFS. And on a production system, you can't have data loss. It's not an option. So BTRFS is not production ready. And there's several vendors that are out there that agree. Red Hat dropped support for BTRFS when 7.4 came out. So they're working to improve upon that. And we're going to see that baked into the newest Linux kernel. So we're going to see BTRFS become more production ready. So those of you that are fans in that camp, you won't have to try and defend it anymore. it'll be there. So we'll have to see whether or not that actually makes it into 4.16. It very well may, or it could slip. That happens. But it's always a good idea to keep an eye on what's coming down the line.
Sounds good. Yeah, and a lot of good Linux news coming down the line, it sounds like, between those two stories. So let's shift gears now a little bit to the cloud. And there weren't any really big announcements this week in terms of cloud computing, but a couple of articles caught our eye that we wanted to talk about, and they kind of went together to help us imagine some scenarios. So ZDNet had an article that basically said, how much an outage could cost you as a user, or as an economy, basically. And they said, and this is according to their insurance provider, so Lloyd's, basically said that if one of the top cloud providers went offline in the U.S. for 3 to 6 days, it would result in losses to the industry of about $15 billion. When when we think about how much data sits in these clouds, and we've talked in the past about the different zones and the different regions, and how different things could go down, and if something could affect the cloud as a whole. But that's a lot of money, because that's a lot of data. So certainly something that we need to be planning for, basically, as people with our data in the cloud.
Yeah, and it's not unheard of for them to have outages, right? Amazon has had outages. Microsoft Azure has outages. 3 to 6 days. I don't think any of them have had an outage that long, so that would be significant. But if you think about all of the infrastructure and the money that they've dumped into it, there's actually one well-known vulnerability that can bring those things down, and that's the BGP routing tables. That the internet uses IPv4 and IPv6 as the main communication protocols, and they use BGP, or the Border Gateway Protocol, to build the routes across the internet. Well, BGP is an insanely trusting network, or a routing protocol, that it'll exchange information with other routers with the barest of authentication and no real encryption. Like, BGP is just too trusting. And over the years, there have been several times where the BGP routing tables have gotten polluted. There was, several years ago, a ISP in China mistakenly published an incorrect BGP route, and accidentally some of the traffic from the U.S. Pentagon was routed into China for a little while. Simple accidents like that totally innocent.
Sure, yeah.
So it's already been weaponized. It can be used very, very easily. It would cause the internet to fracture if somebody pulled an attack like that. So a lot more would go down than just a cloud provider. But if somebody understood the address space that was occupied by AWS or Azure, they could do a BGP attack, and it wouldn't matter how many generators and power grids you have. None of that would matter. If people can't get routed to your network, then you're out of luck.
Yeah, and the article makes a good point that the people that would be affected by this most are actually the small businesses, because not only do they not have the cyber insurance that the Fortune 1000 do, but they're also a lot less likely to have invested in more infrastructure to have either on-site backups of that data, or other providers and things like that, which kind of brings us to the next article in this group here, which is from Tech Republic, and it's about why multi-cloud will become the new standard in 2018. And for me, it basically sounds like to protect yourself against things like this, that if you've got your stuff on multiple cloud providers, you're taking that away as one of the things that could hurt you this badly.
Yeah, and big companies used to do this. Some of them still do. Apple was very visible in the fact that when they set up their iCloud services, they had some in AWS and some in Azure, right? They actually used Microsoft services for powering iCloud for a while. Dropbox did the same thing with theirs, where they had private servers and they had AWS servers to be able to support all their storage. By doing that, you kind of hedge your bets, and you say, I'm going to spread across more than one provider, so if one goes out, I still have the other one and I'm up. Small businesses usually don't have the staff or the technical knowledge to do that, and they'll just deploy in a single provider. Or worse, they'll deploy in a single zone in a single provider, and they'll say, I'm going to put all of my stuff in US East 1A with AWS, and that may make sense from an easier management perspective. But then when that one zone goes out, they've now lost, and that's far more likely than an entire service
Yeah, I was
line.
going to say we've seen that. We've
Yep.
seen zones go down again, not for 4 to 6 days, as the article talked about. But yeah, we've definitely seen that as something that could happen. So that's literally an example of putting all your eggs in one basket. And speaking of the baskets, the next article does a great job of breaking down what services exist out there and kind of their market shares. So I think Don's got that up on his screen, so we can take a look at some of those. We've got Amazon, Microsoft, Alibaba, Google, Rackspace, and then my favorite is others. I love using others, but again, the fact that there are so many others in this, which is represented by the yellow there, shows that it is not all in one place. You think about, God, Amazon's so huge, all of our stuff's there, but if that went down, it's taking down less than half of everything that exists out there.
And for our listening viewers, this little infographic here came from rickandtour.net. And what they did is they basically just kind of try to illustrate what that market share looks like. And you can see where others occupies half the landscape. And that's others is a pretty big word. It's a ton of different providers. But Amazon controls a massive amount of the market share. So in this little pie chart, Amazon is darn near half the thing. I mean, it is a lot of infrastructure there. Microsoft is making headway. We've talked about that.
But the interesting thing with that headway is it's not at the expense of Amazon. As you can see, that Amazon went from 39 to 44%. It's at the expense of others. So they're taking out the little guys, but in more cases, they're swallowing up the little guys and absorbing them into their data centers, I think.
Yeah, providers like Alibaba jumping into the space is making a big difference. And regulations like GDPR is making a big difference where people are saying, all right, well, now I need my servers over in this country or with a different company. Traditional providers like Rackspace, they're the ones who are having a harder time kind of participating in that market. And so we're seeing changes there where Rackspace has started saying, hey, yeah, we can do co-located servers, we can do dedicated hardware, we can do private cloud, but we can also help manage your AWS and manage your Azure. And they're starting to basically go there. So if you're doing multi-cloud deployments, a partner like Rackspace can really, really benefit you because they're not tied to one service. If you call a Microsoft Azure salesperson, they're not going to want you to do multi-cloud. They're going to want you to do, take advantage of all these redundancies we have built into Azure, right? That's what they want. You go with somebody on the outside like Rackspace and you get a different perspective. So multi-cloud is not hard and it's not expensive. The main concern with it is security, right? That if I have my infrastructure deployed in two different environments, that's two different environments I have to secure. And if I have communications going between those environments, I've got to make sure that's secured also. So as long as we plan for that, the rest of it is not really any different than managing a single environment. And if you use a technology like OpenStack, you can actually manage across all of these clouds from one UI, and you basically forget the fact that there's more than one cloud behind them. So definitely something companies should be doing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool because if you look at this chart, I'd look at it and say, wow, Rackspace is the only one that's losing market share, but I didn't realize that that's something they were doing. And I mean, are they the only ones on this list, at least, that you're aware of that provides multi-cloud directly?
There's a few other companies, DigitalOcean.
But I mean, not Amazon, Microsoft, Alibaba, Google.
Yeah, I would say not directly. Some of them participate in OpenStack, a little more friendly than others. And that is basically like supporting multi-cloud, but you won't see that service offering on their website. It's not like they advertise that. So
very cool. Well, so it sounds like if you haven't done so already, at least look into what that option would be to get your data spread off among several cloud providers, if possible, and just insulate yourself a little bit from some of those risks out there. So. Switching gears, another place where you could put all of your data now is this new micro SD card, which is the largest capacity yet, and it is 512 gigabytes. So this always makes me think back to those images you saw of them unloading, a 4 meg drive or something out of a plane in the 60s or 70s, and it was like taking up the whole fuselage, and now you've got a 512 micro SD card, not even an SD card. It's the micro SD card. So I don't know. You seemed happy about this.
So, and what's funny, and I snuck this article in today because I knew you'd be confused why this was important. As
I am.
as an iPhone user,
Oh.
you are wearing Apple's shackles that say when you buy a phone, you get a certain amount of memory, and that's it. And if you want to upgrade, we will gladly sell you a new phone, um, because that's the walled garden that they've created. But for the rest of us, most of our phones accept SD cards, and you can pop in a micro SD card, a tiny little SD card, and add memory to it. This is shocking for Apple users. 128 gig SD cards have become pretty darned affordable. You can get them for usually $50 or $60. 256 gig SD cards, though, those actually run a pretty penny, and usually like $300 or something. Still cheaper than a new phone. But we knew the 500 gig cards were coming. We just didn't know when. Well, the first company has gone to market. Now it's Integral Memory is the name of the company. They've released a 512 gig micro SD card. I wouldn't advise going out and buying the very first one from the first company that made it to market, because you just don't know exactly how that's going to work out. But it means that within the next 6 months, we'll see other vendors jumping in. And when the SanDisks and Patriot Memory and those guys, when they're now starting to push out those SD cards, then you'll know that it's stable enough. And it'll take a little while for phones to be able to support that as well, because they do have to do little driver updates and things to make sure they can recognize the larger space. But it is neat to see on this tiny little card, you can have half a terabyte of storage right there. When you're dealing with tablets, Chromebooks, phones, not iPhones, that people are increasingly using those as their regular day-to-day computers. And you need to be able to expand memory and chuck that in there, increase what's in there, and it is significantly easier than popping in an SSD or something like that. So really neat to see half a terabyte in a mobile device.
Yeah, you're still on this using the phones as computers things, and yeah, I mean this iPhone 10 is probably about the same price as that.
How much storage do you have in your iPhone 10?
I went for the 256 because basically, they told you here's how much it's going to be a month, and then it was like, or you can get the 256 for like $3 more a month.
Was that the highest they offered, or did they have a 500?
Yes. No, I don't believe they had the 512. If they did, I need to have a little talk with Marcus over there at the Verizon
and
store.
that is partly how they get you. I just say how they get you, but part of their business model that
they get me with a great phone.
Well,
John.
you
and
could certainly
emojis.
And I will say the iPhone 10 is a beautiful phone. Like, it is the best looking phone I've ever seen. Whether you like iOS or hate it, it is just a slick looking phone. My Galaxy S8. Some people love it. I don't think it's a pretty phone, but functionally, I love it. It does everything that I want it to do. So, it's about finding the right thing. But with Apple, because you can't upgrade the memory, because I'm not talking about RAM, I'm talking about the SD card, because you can't upgrade the storage, you have to make that decision on purchasing day. When you're buying it, you have to say, all right, well, how much do I want? And that's what I'm going to have until I get rid of this phone. When you have an SD card slot, it's nice to be able to change that.
I will say, though, it's becoming less and less of an issue than it was 2 or 3 generations of iPhone ago, because back then your phone was your iPod, and it had all your music there. Now most people are using a streaming service, be it a Spotify or Amazon Prime Music or Apple's Music itself. So your music is coming elsewhere, and that was taking up a lot of the space. The other thing being photos, of course, and that's now either an iCloud or I use Amazon Prime, for example, to upload my pictures as I take them. So I'm able to keep my phone pretty clear of music, clear of photos, and find that I'm not even getting close to the 256 yet, but I was on the 64, but it took some work.
I did a little Amazon shopping while you were talking there, and on the iPhone site, or on the Apple site, the difference in price between a 64 gig and a 256 gig is $150, right? If you go on Amazon, a good 256 gig SD card, it's about $120. That's only a $30 markup. That's actually not that bad. It used to be highway robbery what they would charge, so it looks like they've gotten a little more reasonable on that.
It's better gigabytes that
Better.
Apple provides.
Yeah, they're Apple gigabytes. Yeah.
So here's a question I had going back to when you were talking about why this is important and how maybe we don't jump out right away and put these in our phones until we kind of see how they work. I've had that issue before with cameras or things where I'll buy that newest, biggest card and it just doesn't work. Why is that? Why can the camera or the phone not recognize the the bigger card?
So there's a few different reasons for it, but when it comes to like SD cards, there's actually multiple chips inside of them that are the non-volatile RAM that this gets written to. And the big limitation on how big they can be is how many of those chips they can fit in that form factor. And if they invent a smaller chip, that makes more room, they can get more in there, and now you can have more space, right? But if they don't invent a smaller chip, then they just have to find better ways to cram it into this small form factor, and typically that generates heat or a high fail rate. You know, the components are just too cramped and they fail too quickly. So it takes them time to get it perfected. And you used to see this with hard drives all the time. Like when 1 terabyte hard drives first came out, if it was a spinning disk, you could open it up and there'd be like 4 platters in it, right? But 2 years later, you could get a 1 terabyte disk and it would only have 1 platter inside of it because they got more efficient, they got better. And by just having 1 spinning platter, the drive would last longer and run more efficiently. So that happens a lot of times with these new technologies. But also, there's a rush to be first to market, right? I have not heard of Integral Memory before, this company, but they were the first to market with it. Now I've heard of them, right? So that they're being rewarded, and maybe, and I want to be fair here, maybe Integral Memory has the best research division in the market, and so that's why they were able to come out with this first. Or maybe they cut a bunch of corners and they've put out a faulty product. You just don't know, right? You've got to kind of wait and see unless that company has a track record. I'm certainly not the connoisseur of memory, so I could certainly be wrong there. But that's usually what we have to wait for. But there are times where the storage crosses a certain threshold, where the storage adapters that are in our phones or computers might only allocate a certain amount of bits to tracking the storage space. And that, you know, it's like addressing, right? That when you have a street address for a house, maybe it's 4 digits or 5 digits, right? Well, what if I had a limit that said the address on your house can only be 5 digits? And then I build 99,999 houses.
You're making me think of Y2K, basically.
Yeah.
It's you know,
Similar concept.
dates have 2 years. Yeah.
So then when you roll over to that next digit, now I need an extra digit, but my controller doesn't support that, right?
Yeah.
So the technology might be there to make the larger drive, but then our systems can't recognize it. And you see that with my son. My son has a Nintendo 2DS, and it takes an SD card, which I thought, wow, that's cool of Nintendo to not do some proprietary memory and just use an SD card. But it's limited to 32 gigs. And it's because with their official firmware, that's the addressing space they set aside is enough to address 32 gigs of storage, which I thought was odd because 16 bits is 64 gigs or so. So they must have picked an odd number. I don't know exactly how they ended up at 32 gigs, but that's what they did. And unless they do a firmware update and sometimes a hardware update, you might not be able to recognize more.
It's just making me think that there's a factory somewhere where they're just literally cramming these in. I'm thinking like guy sitting on a suitcase kind of thing. So maybe Integral has the heaviest guy that could sit on that
There you go.
that press and get them to actually seal it up. They only have made one so far, maybe.
They make 2 products. They make memory and sumo loincloths.
Yeah, there you go. That works. All right. Well, next story. Shifting gears again. You know, this might just seem like a run-of-the-mill story to you. Cisco to acquire hyper-converged infrastructure startup Skyport Systems, but if you're a fan of the ITProTV podcast, then you know that this is probably due to the fact that our very own Don Pizzette interviewed Art Gilliland of the CEO of Skyport Systems back, I want to say in September of this year. So we're really happy for them to see that that they were able to get acquired by such a great brand. Can you remind us a little bit? I wasn't in on that interview, so you can tell us a little bit about what went on there.
So Skyport, we had a great interview with their CEO, and they focus on protecting the edge, right? So the edge of your network. And for example, like let's say you manage the network for a school board, right? So you probably have a core data center somewhere that has great security and protections and everything state of the art. But then you've got to deploy servers and nodes out at your schools, right? Areas where you might not have an IT worker who has their eyeballs on it every single day, where janitors and principals and other people have physical access to where those servers are stored. Or you're deploying in a co-location facility where, again, you're trusting a third-party company to manage your equipment and not mess with it when you're not watching, right? That's part of the challenge that we have when we trust or we put our hardware somewhere that's untrusted. So what Skyport does is they actually have several different technologies they can use to protect your systems that are deployed this way. So if you go back and watch the interview, we talk about some of those and how they work. But their main product is a product called SkySecure, and it allows you to basically create a hardened chassis for a system so that if it gets tampered with, the data is effectively destroyed. Like if somebody were to try and open the case to do a bypass or steal a hard drive or whatever, the data becomes invalid. They're just not able to get at your information. So really, really handy for people that are deploying in untrusted environments. You get that secured. So they've been working with Cisco for years. I know they had received, I think it was about $100 million in funding from various companies.
It says $67 million in funding, and it's got Intel Capital, Alphabet Inc., GV, and Index Ventures. And Cisco itself backed Skyport through a $30 million round completed in 2016.
That's where I'm getting my 97 from then. Yeah, 97 million. And this is all from SiliconANGLE, if you want to read more about it at siliconangle.com. But basically, they had a great product, and it made sense that somebody was going to acquire them. I sort of figured that one of the bigger cloud providers would do it, but it makes sense for Cisco. Cisco has a big security offering now, and they're entering that data center space, trying to get away from routers and switches and get into more of this cloud infrastructure. So congratulations to the Skyport team that's out there, and you're welcome for the amazing media coverage that led to the acquisition.
Yeah, I used to watch Colbert all the time. And he talked about the Colbert bump, and that's basically this is the first person that's realized the ITProTV podcast bump, which apparently is on about a 4-month cycle.
We need to start tracking that.
Yeah, so there you go. So for those of you who we interviewed in December, congratulations ahead of time. Look forward to those announcements in March.
And for our listeners, if any of you are running a company and you're interested in being acquired by Cisco, drop us a line. We'll do an interview. It'll be great.
Yeah, happy to help. That's really all it takes. All right, now the moment you've all been waiting for. Don gets to tell us about this story, which I'll just give you the headline because literally the headline is all I know in this one because you threw this at me here at the last minute. But the headline is Jeopardy champ. So we're talking about the show. Jeopardy champ hacked accounts of college president and vice president. And so you mentioned this story has just a whole series of antagonists. So I'd love to hear more about this, Don.
All right. This article, I started reading this article over the weekend and just I was laughing out loud, and it's really a tragedy, the whole thing. But this is coming out of what website was this? MLive, out of a Michigan news website. I'm a huge Detroit Red Wings fan, and so I read a lot of news out of Michigan, even though I don't live there. And I came across this article. So basically, there was a former Jeopardy champion. Her name is Stephanie Jass. She was like a 7-time winner, and she won so much money. I think she won more money than any other female contestant on the show. I think, what was the guy from
can't remember his
Salt
name
Lake?
now.
I think he won more. But anyhow, so she's a big Jeopardy champion. Pretty awesome, right? She goes back to her hometown. She's working for a college, and then all of a sudden, she's arrested for basically hacking, right? Hacked the accounts of college president and vice president. So that sounds pretty bad. And in my mind, just running off the headline, I'm thinking she's obviously smart, right? A Jeopardy champion and college professor, so intelligent person. One, why would she hack somebody's account? And two, how did she do it, right? Let's learn a little more of the details. And then as I started reading the article, it all just fell apart. So basically, and I'm gonna tell you guys the story as I can interpret it. And for the astute listeners out there, you're probably not going to believe me, or you're going to think I'm leaving details out. But I'm going to give you everything that's out there, right? So basically, the college had a power outage, right? And after the power outage, their email that was actually hosted as part of Google's G Suite, right? So they don't run their own mail servers. They use Google G Suite to host all the email accounts for the college staff. After the power outage, they had to reset everybody's password so they could get into their email. Now, I don't know why that is exactly. I've never heard of a power outage requiring password resets across the board, but somehow it required them to reset everybody's password. So then they sent out a message, I believe it was a text message, to all of the staff saying, we had to reset everybody's password to fix the problem from the power outage. Again, makes no sense. And so we reset everybody's password to this one, password 123 or something like that. And you need to log in and change your password as soon as you can.
Well, they can't email them this information.
They can't email them. So it was like a text or some other kind of communication. If people were out of the office, they didn't see it right away. So this Jeopardy champion, she said, wow, they made everybody's password the same. So all she did was log into the college president, the college vice president's account using this password because they just hadn't changed theirs yet. And then she dumped their mailbox to have a copy of it. It's not really hacking. It's gross stupidity on multiple levels.
Well, I've got a series of questions. Is that it?
There's a little bit more,
Okay,
but that's
go
enough for
ahead.
us to run with. If you
Well,
want.
let me first ask you. I see the issue on the college's side. If for some reason you had to actually reset everyone's passwords, which I can't get from point A to B of why you would have to do that based on a power outage as well. I would assume you'd go with something like your social security number or this personal identifiable information we have about you, so that something like this couldn't happen. Have you ever run into a situation like this where you've worked where you've had to generate a password for someone?
Sure, yeah. So what we have to remember here is that it's at scale, right?
Yeah.
So it's not one person's password. Maybe it was 1,000 people's passwords,
Sure.
right? So if an actual situation happened, let's say there was a server compromise. I saw unauthorized traffic in the mail server, right? I might immediately cut access to that server. We might restore a backup of the mail server to bring it back online, and then we might reset everyone's password to try and get back to a stable environment, right? Well, when you reset everybody's password, you don't set it to one password for everybody. It just doesn't make sense. You're effectively telling everybody else's password. You can't do that. But at the same time, your suggestion, Peter, I would have to get some kind of unique information for each person and upload that in a CSV or something to automate resetting all of those passwords. That's not really realistic either. So instead, you're supposed to rely on recovery accounts, right? And with G Suite, when you set it up, you give somebody an email address, right? But then they all have a backup email address that's put in when they log in the first time. So they could generate a password reset request that would be a unique link sent to them to their backup account to be able to fix that, or a PIN number that's sent to their phone via text message or some other out-of-channel communication that's not tied to that main email account. G Suite has that functionality by default turned on. This college had that functionality. They probably just didn't know it. They didn't have the staff. And you see this when people roll out cloud solutions like this, where they say, well, Google manages it for me. To an extent, you still have to learn how to use it. And so it's easy to go in and reset 1,000 accounts and set them all to the same password. That's what they did. So that's a big mistake. The quote from the college, though, was really humorous, and I've got to find it in here. Basically, where they said that that none of this would have happened if somebody hadn't inappropriately used the computer system. And I'm thinking the person was the network administrator. They shouldn't have done the wrong password, but they're actually talking
That's
about
inappropriate use of the computer system, I'd say.
They were talking about her, and it was just comical because they didn't want to admit that it was basically their fault.
Well, while you're looking for that, it makes me think too that in the situation you hypothesized that maybe they saw someone was in this server, and so they decided to shut down that server. Maybe they couldn't find how to shut down that server and said, let's just take the whole grid down, and that will take the server down, and then we'll figure that back out. Now we figured out where it is. Now let's bring the grid back up and go ahead and take that server offline. But I have to wonder now, was this a crime of opportunity on her part, or did she cause the power to go down? That's the hot take.
Maybe she is a brilliant person. Who knows what her capabilities are? I did find the quote where the college representative said that the method they used, right, because it was a two-step method or whatever, where they reset the password and you log in and you're required to set a new password. They said the method worked just fine had there not been manipulation of the system. In other words, if everybody had just been honest and logged into their account and changed their password, it would have been fine. But I'm certain they weren't checking password ages to see like who hasn't changed from that default password. There might still be people today that have that default password on there, which is just absolutely crazy.
And it's safe to assume that only she got caught, right? Because there's got to be. I think everyone that would get that email would go, "Wait, all of our passwords are password 1234?"
If you read the story, apparently she was bragging about some information to a colleague that she kind of ratted herself out.
Yeah.
And that's the only way. Otherwise, I don't think they would have caught her.
Yeah.
So other people may have done this as well. You know, if a student received an email, a student would have put this, would have put two and two together and logged in and got access to stuff. And dumping a mailbox is super easy.
Yeah.
Any IMAP client does it usually automatically. But another piece of irony was a tweet that she put out, which was this one. She said, it wasn't a tweet, it was a Facebook comment. And this is a quote straight from her. "That moment with IT, or I guess when, all right, she's not great at grammar, but she's smart. That moment when IT publishes a universal passcode for everyone's email, and you freak out for a second until you realize that one, no one wants to read your stupid emails, and two, you've been forwarding all your work emails to your private Gmail, so there's nothing there anyway." Right? That was her reaction. So at first she was kind of outraged that somebody could get into her email, but it's obvious she then took that a step further and said, "Wait a minute, I can get into other people's email," and she went on and did it.
It's amazing how the human mind works. Well, to answer your earlier question, who is Ken Jennings?
Oh, Ken Jennings. Yep,
he was the big Jeopardy winner of 74 games back in 2004.
Well, Miss Jass, we will soon be able to ask you what is 10 to 20, with possible chance of parole. She's going to be in big trouble. So, lesson of the story there, don't do it. Not every criminal is brilliant. Not every hacker is brilliant. The newspapers, they are just ready to call anybody a hacker these days. This was bad IT. And she certainly, did a crime here, right? So she's going to get in trouble. But honestly, I almost don't want to blame her because this is bad IT.
Oh, if I'm her, I'm suing for negligence and entrapment because basically they put this in front of her and said, "Don't touch it." Well, that's hard. That's not fair. Poor lady.
So anyhow, if you get bored, we'll post a link to this article. It's a fun read. I laughed out loud on multiple paragraphs inside of this thing because it's just a travesty. Like everybody in this article did something wrong. But only one is arrested, so we'll see where that goes. Yeah,
and I've had some people ask about posting links to articles that we share. So if you're watching this on iTunes or something like that, it's a little harder to put all that in the description. Yeah. But what I can do is we post these on YouTube as well, and we have a playlist on YouTube. So we'll go ahead and try to put those down in the description on YouTube so you can enjoy what we've been able to enjoy and read all those articles. And that's a lot of fun to do.
We could add 20 minutes to the end of the each episode and read off the URL.
http://www 742. Yeah, that's great. We'll do that. That'll get listenership and viewership right up. Yeah, so we could put them on the screen for those watching, but for those listening, that'd be a pain in the butt. Well, anyway, thank you all for watching today, and that's pretty much going to wrap it up for us today. I feel good. A lot of times I come out of this scared out of my mind about all the terrible things happening in the world. I mean, it's just that Spectre and meltdown stuff kind of still lurking around, but for the most part, things are getting pretty good. So if you have not done so yet, please take a moment, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with your friends. And we really appreciate it if you can drop us a review on there as well. It really helps us out in moving up the rankings. But I guess next week we'll come back in week 5. I know we've got some interviews that we're hopefully getting to very soon. And so we'll bring those to some exciting ones, some people that will be acquired by Cisco come June, July, I think. So look out for those. But until next time, for Don, I'm Peter, and we'll see you next time.